I'm Isabel and I have Di with me. About 31 years ago, we became friends over reading the book of Zechariah. Bible reading is a big part of our friendship and relationship, and we're really excited that we're going to get to explore Lamentations with you at EQUIP22. One of the biggest questions that we have in terms of reading Lamentations is, where does it fit in the Bible story?
Yes, it's probably the most important question to ask, and the answer is quite surprising, that it's central to the Bible story.
Because it's a very little book, right?
It's a little book, but very, very central. So the story starts back in Genesis, and there we have God creating the Garden of Eden, God's people, God's place, God's rule. But they reject God's rule, and there's the first fall. Now in Genesis 12, the story could end there, but in Genesis 12, God gives promises to Abraham, and he says there'll be God's people, God's place, God's rule again, and there'll be a blessing to the whole world, which is wonderful. And so the rest of the Old Testament, you're looking to see, when is God going to actually fulfill those promises to Abraham? The story has lots of twists and turns, like the Exodus and the wandering around the wilderness. But we get to Joshua and we get to the edge of the promised land. It's so exciting, about to go in. But the high point of the Old Testament is under David and Solomon, the kings. Because then all the promises seem to be ticked off. They're God's people again, in God's place, under God's rule. And really the symbol of that is Jerusalem, the city. Because there is the temple where God dwells with his people. There's the palace, the king. That is the symbol. It's called the city of David. It's called the place where God's name resides. Yes. It's called the resting place of God's people. So Jerusalem, in Psalm 46, it says, God is in that city, and therefore Jerusalem cannot fall.
But, so that's about 1000 BC.
That's 1000 BC, yes.
So the Book of Lamentations is like 400-500 years after that.
Exactly, and Psalm says that the Jerusalem cannot fall, but in 587 BC, Jerusalem fell. God actually abandoned his city, purposely left his city. After many, many warnings, he left his city, and therefore Babylon destroyed her and the people went to exile. So it's an incredible time of crisis for God's people. They thought they had it all. They had everything. They had Jerusalem, God's people, God's place, God's rule. And now, in a foreign land, under foreign rule, can you still be God's people? They have so many spiritual questions. And in some senses, they don't throw the blame. They know that actually God warned them this would happen. They rejected him, and so this is like a second fall because of their sin. And so they're left wondering what actually will happen next. So Lamentations can be sort of best pictured as a woman weeping. Not just individual women, but the woman is the city. That's why it's the city of tears, because that's where the people are left. Now, are they abandoned by God? Now they have no city. You know, in Daniel, when they're in exile, interestingly, he prays facing Jerusalem, because that is their hope. And yet it seems like all hope has been dashed.
And in fact, it seems after this particular point where they're deported to Babylon, that even in the writings of the prophets that remain in the Old Testament, there's a shift in the way that they talk about Jerusalem after Lamentations.
Yes. They pick up, but somehow they know that Jerusalem is still important, but how can it be when it's been destroyed? And then even when they get back there, it's a shadow of its former self. But what the prophets say is they put the word new in front of the old. So they think things like the covenant, there'll be a new covenant. Heart, there'll be a new heart. New sacrifice, and there'll be a new Jerusalem. So somehow that's going to still be God's city, but it's going to be in a new way that's coming in the future.
So I guess for us, as we read the Book of Lamentations, we can feel that it is at this real low point in the history of God's people. Questionably the lowest in the Old Testament, but not without some sort of glimmers of hope.
No, there's little glimmers of hope in chapter 3, but in one sense you have to read on to the future prophets to see that there's actually more than glimmers of hope. There really is hope, but it's confusing and doesn't make sense until we get to the New Testament.
So I think the other area that's really unfamiliar for us with Lamentations is that it's a book of poems.
It is,
now,
yes.
I don't know about you, but lots of us are not familiar with, this whole kind of genre of poetry, yet alone Hebrew poetry. So can you talk to us a little bit more about what to do with these poems, how we can read them?
They're very raw and honest, so they're very personal poems.
There's a lot of emotion,
There's a lot of emotion, and so they're trying to describe grief and give language to grief, which is quite unorderly. Like grief is not, you don't write a thesis on grief, it
kind of spills out.
It spills out of you. But what's really interesting is in the Hebrew, the whole of Lamentations is very orderly. It's an incredibly carefully constructed description of grief. So there's 5 laments or 5 chapters, 5 poems. And each of them is 22 verses long. Even, actually, in your Bible, in the NIV, you might see that it's 66 verses in Lament 3, but actually it's just been separated out. They're all 22 verses or 22 stanzas. The reason for that?
Why 22?
It's the Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters. Okay, so they're all 22. Now, interestingly, the first 4 are acrostics, which means they use the Hebrew alphabet to structure them. So verse 1 starts with A, verse 2 starts with B, obviously of the Hebrew alphabet, verse 3 is C. So as you're reading them, in the Hebrew you see A, B, C. The next one, A, B, C, A, B, C, goes on like that. But interestingly, the 5th lament is not an acrostic.
Oh, so still 22 verses.
Exactly, but it's not
an acrostic. Okay,
now let's go through a little bit more detail. So Lament 1 is 22 verses of 3 lines each. And it's an acrostic, A, B, C. And the key word is she because it's describing the desperate city. Lament 2, very similar. 22 verses, 3 lines, a simple acrostic, A, B, C, but it swaps to he, that's the key word, because it's describing God's righteous anger. Lament 3 breaks the pattern. It's actually 22 verses, 3 lines, the same, but it's a triple acrostic, which means in every verse, every line is AAA, BBB, C. You can feel the intensity of it because it's describing, the key word is I, it's the eyewitness's account, the poet. Now, when we get to Lament 4, it's still 22 verses, but only 2 lines each, a little bit shorter. Sort of limps a little bit, slows the pace. And the key word there is it. It's describing the poor city. Well, Lament 5 breaks all the patterns. It's 22 verses, but only 1 line for each.
Oh, so that would feel quite short.
It's definitely shorter. The pace is shorter, and it's not an acrostic. So after all these ABCs, there's none of that. It's very sort of bare and raw, and the key word there is we. Becomes corporate. It's actually a prayer. So after the description, the honest, raw description of 1 to 4, the laments, Lament 5 is the response of God's people to God. It's a corporate prayer.
So in a way, as we read it, it moves towards this climax in chapter 3.
Yes.
And then it kind of peters out, would you say that?
Peters out in one sense. It's just it's left unresolved. But in one sense, Lament 5 in some ways is the conclusion. It's when they actually respond corporately to God. But it has that unsettled sense of, what next, Lord? Like, what actually is going to happen next?
So as we read this book, given that there's so much emotion and raw imagery, how do we expect to feel as we read stuff like this?
I think you should expect to feel deeply sad. We read it together, a lot of the girls at church on Sunday, and there was tears sort of on the way through in different verses because you should feel sad. I think how can we not feel sad when we read about someone else's suffering?
Yeah,
and
especially as intense.
It's so intense. When we read about the fall of Jerusalem, it's dreadful. So it is so sad. But there's a deeper sadness as well, or another layer of sadness when you realise they're no different than me. They were punished because of their sin, and that's me. And you start reflecting on your own suffering and sin. But there's an even deeper layer because Lamentations points us to Jesus' Lamentations. So we think the fall of Jerusalem, how could it be worse than that? That is such a dreadful time of human history, dreadful suffering. But actually Jesus' Lamentations is the worst Lamentations, the worst suffering in all of human history. The Garden of Gethsemane, what does Jesus say? He cries out to his Father, please, Father, take this cup away from me, but not my will, but your will be done. And then on the cross, he laments again. He cries out to his Father, my God, why have you forsaken me? So as we read Lamentations, I think we feel grief and sadness at the suffering of others. It resonates with our own sense of sin and suffering, but also points us to the lament, the Lamentations of Jesus.
Thanks, Di. That's really helpful for us as we come to this book. We're really looking forward to spending time in Lamentations with you on June 18. We've prepared some resources for you to help you engage and read the book. Can I encourage you, if you have a moment, to read it before you come to the conference? I think that'll make it a richer experience for you because it is such an unfamiliar book, and so the more that you read it, the more that you'll be able to hear what God is saying to you.